Welcome to Christian Parent Crazy World, the podcast that tackles tough topics to help you be a godly parent in an ungodly world. I am your host, Catherine Seegers, and in today's episode, we will tackle this very timely and sensitive question: how do we find freedom from sexual sin? Just look at Christian headlines around the country and the world for all of about 2 seconds, and it is painfully obvious that we have a problem with sexual sin in the church. Our leaders have a problem, and we have a problem. My special guest today is perhaps the least likely person to write a book on finding freedom from sexual sin. You will see why in just a moment. But Dr. Lina Abujamra has found freedom in this area, and trust me, you are going to want to hear what she has to say. That's the plan for this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World. So let's get started. This is such a huge topic today, moms and dads. My special guest is Dr. Lina Abujamra. Lina is a pediatric emergency room doctor who now practices telemedicine full-time so that she can oversee Living with Power ministries. For over 20 years, Lina has been teaching the Bible and speaking at conferences, retreats, and colleges, both here and overseas. She is the author of several books, including her most recent book, Don't Tell Anyone You're Reading This, a Christian Doctor's Thoughts on Sex, Shame, and Other Troublesome Issues. Lina is very familiar with pain and brokenness, especially sexual brokenness, which is what we are talking about today. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, Lina is perhaps the least likely candidate to write a book on sex. Why is that? Well, because she never married, and she is a self-described 52-year-old virgin. Yep, never had sex. And yet, Lina was not immune to sexual sin. I'll let Lina share with you that journey and how she found herself longing for freedom, never quite finding it, until she asked some really hard questions. Lina has one of the most compelling personal stories you will ever hear. So today's episode is part one of a longer conversation where we just began to define the problem, what ails us as Christians when it comes to sexual sin, and where we can find freedom. I just wanted to say one thing before we dive into the deep end here. Lina and I recorded this episode several months ago, and there have been at least 2 major sex scandals with big Christian ministries that have rocked the Christian world since then. Actually, sadly, there have probably been way more than 2, but it seems like every other week another scandal erupts in the church. And some of these ministries are platforming people while they are in quote-unquote restoration programs for sexual sin. Seriously, I cannot begin to wrap my head around that. I plan to cover that topic at some point on CPCW because I think that it is very important. We have got to hold our leaders accountable in this area. This conversation could not be more current. Our leaders are struggling with sexual sin, and so is the church. So are we. We need to have a very frank conversation about this, and who better to do that with than an ER doctor who has literally seen it all and has found freedom from sexual sin herself. So with that said, let's jump right in. Lina, welcome to Christian Parent Crazy World. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
I am so happy to be with you. I've been talking to you and getting to know you. I feel like we're 2 of a kind.
Yes, yes.
Fast, think fast, and
exactly.
Excited about the Lord.
Kindred spirits, for sure. So I am really excited for my listeners to get to know you. You have just a fascinating background. So I want you to share a little bit about that and then tell us how in the world you came to write a book on the sexual practices of Christians, because, you're not exactly the most obvious candidate to write this book, which I think is fascinating. So give us the lowdown on all things Lina.
Yeah. All right. Well, for better or for worse, I was born in Lebanon. I'm Lebanese, which is interesting time in our country to claim to be from that part of the world. In fact, my mother is Palestinian, interestingly. She was a refugee, or I guess they left their home. I don't know that I ever heard them refer to themselves as that growing up, but she landed in Lebanon at age 7. And of course, her family was a little bit more, her dad was a pharmacist, so they were able to settle in and, didn't have a tent or whatnot. So in a sense, I grew up with my parents. She married my dad, who was Lebanese, shortly after she came to know Jesus. And she came to know Jesus really by God's sovereign design and grace, honestly, through her readings. She had come across St. Augustine studying philosophy in college. She herself was studying to be a pharmacist. And that really just was what God used to get a hold of her heart. She ended up joining a church that was a lot of the college discipleship navigators were in that community. So grew up, sort of in the faith. I married my dad early in her Christian walk. He was not a follower of Jesus, but he was a typical doctor who is Lebanese. Mom brings up the kids, he brings home the money, in a sense, which was a blessing for us at that point. His background was Greek Orthodox, so it wasn't like he was opposed to Christianity, but he really didn't have a walk with the Lord growing up until about 15 years into their marriage. He then converted to Christ and had a tremendous relationship with the Lord until he died a few years ago. But my mother really brought us up in a church, very American in some ways. Our pastor was an American. He and his wife died when they were well into their early hundreds down in Florida after serving in Cambodia first and then in Lebanon. And just really, I remember our church was in English. My faith language was in English. I don't remember learning English. The Lebanese speak multiple languages. French and English are commonly spoken. And so I came to faith at a young age, much like, honestly, a Christian home in the U.S. My background feels more that from a church world, even though our context was Beirut in the heart of the Civil War in West Beirut. We grew up in West Beirut. And so we moved to the U.S., to Green Bay, Wisconsin, when I was 15 and a senior in high school. And I went on to become a doctor. I thought I would be a missionary doctor at one point. I had given my life to Christ. I had spent summers at camp, very, serious about the faith. I wasn't really a bad kid in the sense of rebellion, outward rebellion in a sense. And in some ways, looking back, I think I thought God had a good deal in getting me. And I know that, sometimes it feels like so proud to say that, but I felt like I was like a Lebanese Christian. I spoke languages. I wanted to be a doctor. Wow, I could do so much for the kingdom, right? And in hindsight, you chuckle because it's so naive, but
we all realize, come to God with that kind of mentality. Oh, look what God's getting here. Oh, not all of us. Some of us do, though.
And then he shows you in his word, he uses a donkey. And so you're like, some days, anyway. So I didn't become a missionary doctor. Ironically, the reason that I decided not to is I found out, a lot of things are happening in that residency. I went to do my residency in pediatrics. And at the last second, at the end of med school, I decided to do pediatrics because it was shorter and I thought I could get to the mission field faster. I was debating between that and surgery. And I got engaged in residency and ended the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding. So that sort of changed the dynamic of my walk with the Lord. A lot of things I thought God would do didn't happen. And I also decided I didn't realize that to be a missionary, you had to go to people and ask for money. And as a Lebanese person, it was we don't ask for money. We all pay for things. It's just that I thought I can't do that. And so I ended up, and I also realized I don't love general pediatrics. I'm sorry for all the moms listening. It's not that I don't love the kiddos. It's just that I'm just a little too fast, just fast-paced and disaster-oriented. I think than the average
better
pediatrician.
Suited for other disciplines.
For the ER. Well, for the ER. So I went into ER, which was also a gift of how the Lord opened that door at the last second, despite my not making decisions on time because I was sidetracked with all the personal stuff. And when I went to do my fellowship in pediatric ER is when God really did a lot. He started healing me from some of those. It was like my first big Christian existentialist crisis where, you live your whole life thinking God's going to function in this box.
Yes.
And then he doesn't.
Right.
And when he doesn't, you have to decide if you really believe this God or not. And ironically, he used his word, and particularly the minor prophets, the book of Hosea, was so instrumental for me in turning me around and sending me back. And I started teaching a Sunday school class in that season. And the rest, as they say, is history. I felt bivocationally called. I felt like God still wanted me to be a doctor. And I also could see his hand putting me in the ER that would lend itself to teaching the Bible. So I just figured God would make a way to do both. That was in the year 2000. And in those last 25 years, the Lord has indeed done that. I started at some point a ministry called Living with Power Ministries, and my focus was discipleship and Bible teaching and writing. And the Lord just grew that little by little, started writing with Moody, and then have a lot of different things we do. Of course, the podcast, the books, the Bible studies, I have devotionals. And then I've continued to practice medicine. And eventually, the last angle that God took is open up a way in 2015 to do work, interestingly, back in the Middle East, where we went right. It was, again, another big crisis I've had a lot of little crises, but 2 or 3 big crises. And the second big crisis was in relation to the church. I left a church that was very abusive in nature in hindsight. When I was in it, it used to be great, and then kind of blew up and was in the news, in the Christian news for a while. And I was very deeply wounded, deeply hurt, and wrote a book eventually about it called Fractured Faith that connected a lot with people who've gone through church hurt. And so out of that, the Lord invited me to go back to start working with Syrian refugees, which is very interesting too, because as a Lebanese, we're not very fond of Syrians. Like we used to be at war to a certain degree. And yet it's been interesting to watch even the Lebanese people and their relationship with the Syrians, the Lebanese Christians. And so we came in and started doing medical clinics. And now we actually have a Living with Power office in Lebanon. And we continue to do work with both the Lebanese and the Syrian refugees. And so it's been fascinating. Not the ministry I thought I would have in many ways, what God promises above and beyond what I could ask or think. But exactly where God has me. So, then why did I write a book about sex? Well, a couple of reasons. Yes, you're right. I mean, who wants to do that? And so I'm single. I never married. I got engaged twice. And the first time, the story behind the story was that there was a best friend. And I thought God was going to I thought he was the one, and I got engaged to someone else. And by the time I figured out, because I was young, and I graduated high school early. If you caught that, I was 16 when I graduated high school. So I think maybe there's a lot of immaturity in the equation, not knowing myself, not knowing, I hadn't dated a lot, all the stuff that Christians who are conservative, who are brought up to not date a lot, to be very, and again, not that, it's just that was my story. And it translated into decisions that by God's grace stopped before they became too late. So by the time I ended the engagement, the other friend had found somebody else. So that was part of my big first existential crisis, because I thought I was going to marry this guy. And I thought even breaking off the engagement, God was going to redeem that relationship. And then I got engaged again about 10 years later, and that also didn't move forward for other reasons. But one of them was at that point we had different directions of ministry. But honestly, I had left that big church that for some time was extremely inspiring and revival feeling, so it was really, really, really good for a while, and then went really, really, really bad. And after that blow up, and I left it and sort of suffered for a few years trying to make ends of spiritual understanding of churches and God and the priorities of how that all fits in and what I really believe God's goodness. Stories started to trickle through social media back. I left that church in 2013. And right that year was when I published my first book called Thrive. And it was a book for singles. And interestingly, in it, there is a chapter specifically on masturbation, which I think, sort of hinted. There's a lot on other topics related to singles that have to do with, I think all the emotional, the spiritual, the physical, there's more overlap than we like to think. And so that book really dealt on a certain level with idolatry, with shame, but very surfacely looking back. I think it was a bit more prescriptive, very sound. And honestly, people have written to me, like really impacted their life. But I felt like it was a great book for 2013. And then between 2013 and 2020, when I wrote Don't Tell Anyone You're Reading This, something shifted in our culture.
Definitely.
What we used to talk about in closed doors has become TikTok.
Yeah.
Right? Even things we couldn't talk about in closed doors are TikTok, which is what everyone is watching. They tell us, I don't have I get TikTok sporadically to put a clip but then I come off it. I'm too old for it. Honestly, it's my age. Like I confess, I'm 50. I just turned 52. Right. So we didn't catch that wave of TikTok, but evidently the numbers show that it's the thing. And so we entered into this era. And the other thing that happened besides our cultural shift in sexuality and the lack of any kind of morality culturally, not Christian, just culture, but also it's aside from the big cultural changes, the church changed in that one of the big things I've noticed in the last 10 years is the number and the frequency of stories of explosive sexual sin in church.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Churches that used to not have those stories.
Right.
Like we always had the stories of the televangelist. We were used to that.
Right.
But the biblical, conservative, solid churches, I don't think I ever, and some of it, honestly, is social media, because you see them. Like you can access them. What is happening in Birmingham is all of a sudden my news, because I flick on a screen and I can see it. But so there was clearly a problem. Like, how can we, and these churches, many of them, like in some ways they were like, I pick on one person, like who, but the whole implosion of the Ravi Zacharias ministry. And I think I can say this comfortably. It imploded. Whether I get emails once in a while, people saying, how do you know it's true? I think it's been investigated, and I think there's enough data to show that. But regardless, let's say you're a skeptic. The truth is that was the least person that we thought would have this hidden life.
Exactly. You are so right about that. We never expected it from him.
Exactly. And one thing that tipped the scales to me is a story broke out when I wrote the book. In fact, I wasn't thinking of writing the book, of a worship leader that I knew. And it made the web, news. He was somewhat on, not a hugely known name, but anyone who was associated with my old church knew who he was and respected him deeply. And it really hit home, because I had seen him from a past where he had confessed to some sin before marriage and kind of publicly, talked about in church, because he was in leadership, and brought back 2 years later, married, had a healthy family, supposedly. And then something happened leading up to it became this debacle. And I thought, how could this human come with these anointed worship songs on Sunday and have this hidden life? And this wasn't a one-off. It was like a 6 months pattern where it led to the point where he was going to leave his family to be with this person. So it wasn't like, oh, whoops, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not that either is better or worse. It's just, in a sense, when you're in a pattern for that long, it's clearly there's more premeditative thought, so it wasn't like, oh, I'm so sorry. I never meant to do it. Let's go to counseling. No, it was like, I want to leave the family. By God's grace, They're still together. But it was like to that. So it hit me in a different way, where I realized this is a significant problem. And I realized from my years of walking through doing Today's Single Christian on radio, ministry to singles, and doing a lot of youth ministry over the years, and writing about singleness. And so hitting, having the opportunity to talk about sexual sin in the past, realizing that I also understood the struggle to a certain degree, though by God's grace, I'd never gone as far. And I've started thinking as an ER doctor, and this is where I think sometimes God picks certain people to do certain jobs, and an ER doctor can talk about things in a way that another professional might not be able to. I don't have any problem talking about body parts, because it's what I have to use that language. I have to be very direct in my job. And I realized that we were almost in a situation where our culture is an ER culture, but Christians are still using like elementary school teacher language. Like, it didn't match. And so I felt that there needed to be a book about this topic that was direct and blunt, TikTok in a way, although they wouldn't say my book has that edge, the TikTok edge, but more open than maybe I'd written about it before. And so I decided, as you pray about these things and the Lord leads you, I felt like God was saying, just tell your story. And so it is memoirish in the sense that I really use myself. And I think in our culture, it's very hard to say, this is right, this is wrong. Not that we shouldn't, but you have less of an audience sometimes than to say, here's what I can tell you has happened to me. And here's how God has revealed his grace to me and how he's helped me. And who can argue with that? Whether you agree with my views, which are biblical views or not, you can't come and say, well, you're wrong. Well, it's my story. You can't. I mean, I'm taking the cultural definitions of your truth is your truth. Okay, I'm telling you my story. And so I think it has been a book that maybe has been readable by people who might not normally read a typical Christian book. So I don't know.
Hey, mamas and papas, did you know that I am now offering transcripts of all my new episodes for my subscribers? Woohoo! You asked for it, you got it. So, to make sure that you are in the know about every episode and you get those transcripts, as well as all of my other free resources, the topical scripture lists for your kids, the bundle of resources for prodigal parents, my ebook, Beyond the Lies, Uncovering 5 Myths Our Culture Spreads to Mothers, head on over to CatherineSeegers.com today, and be sure to subscribe on whatever app you are listening on. That will really bless the show. Now back to my conversation with Lina. No, I think you're absolutely right. We just celebrated 100 episodes here on CPCW, and I went over some of the primary apologetic ways that we can approach and defend the faith. And there were 5 primary views that we were studying when I was in graduate school. You have like the classical method and the evidential method and the cumulative method and the presuppositional and a reformed epistemological method. And they kind of all vary quite a bit. Some of them are almost diametrically opposed. But the one thing they agree on, this is fascinating, and it is what you just touched on, is that they all give preeminence to the experience of an individual with God. So your story, now we live in a culture where your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. But when we're in that culture, bringing our experience to the table, our experience with a living God and how he has brought freedom into places where everybody else is experiencing bondage. What a testimony that is. And like you said, you don't get to have your opinion about my experience. It's my experience. And this is your experience, which you share in the book. And I love the title that you almost had. I thought that was hilarious.
I like it almost better. I know. I've wondered sometimes. I know, but well, tell them what it is so they don't have to sit on the edge of their seat.
I don't have it right in front of me. It was
eggplants and peaches and eggplants and peaches. Eggplants and peaches. Right. It was that. It was meant to be funny, and it was. And honestly, the subtitle was "Sexual Memoir of a 50-year-old virgin." I was 50 when I wrote it. It published last year, so I just turned 52, so I'm adjusting to the ages. But yeah, and I feel like in hindsight, I chickened out because I think the non-Christian market really liked that.
Yeah.
And deconstructive Christians, who I have some audience from the deconstruct, and they really liked it. But the conservative Christians, to whom I'm really writing this book, because my goal partly is to give testimony to non-believers of what God, his plan is not crazy. Like there really is a truth to freedom, to living God's ways, and the guilt that we feel and the shame that we feel, like it's not accidental. Like, I mean, everything that God uses our sin to convict us, right? So there's a path and a way, but there's also freedom and grace. And like I talk about this, which I think somebody who doesn't know Christ, they might open up a conversation about these things. So basically, I wrote the book in mind for Christians, really. It wasn't, that's why we changed the title, because a lot of the more conservative Christian audiences really had their feathers ruffled with that title, and they thought it was offensive. And it's okay. I understand that. It was a little out of the box, but I've thought since then, I wonder what would have happened if I published it under that. And you have to trust the Lord's doing. But I think at the end of the day, my heart was to try to reach the Christian who looks like they're living a godly, I hate to use the word, but quote unquote, I say perfect Christian life. On the outside, looking like teaching the Bible, going to church, hosting Bible studies, praying for revival, wanting those things, and yet secretly, like the worship leader who moved me to write the book, writing worship songs on Sunday that move people. And yet there's a hidden pattern of dealing with stress in our life that ultimately can implode into the stories that we're reading about now, because of the access that we have with all of the things that we have, as you know. And so I think, I think that's that's my market. And so I changed the title, and now it's called Don't Tell Anyone You're Reading This, because no one, not a Christian, wants to acknowledge the secret sinful habits. So hopefully Christians can read it. And I always tell people, if you don't want anyone to know you're reading it, remove that fly leaf of the hardcover, and no one will have a clue what you're reading.
I think it's intriguing. It's very provocative. Both of them were provocative. I just thought it was fascinating. Both titles, I think, are, and the subject matter. I want to hone in on the magnitude of the problem that we have. You said in the book that you don't really like focusing on stats, but at the same time, they paint a picture that is hard to ignore. Yeah. These mind-blowing statistics you had in the book, these you had them on a couple of different pages. On page 26, you talk about how half of Americans ages 18 to 30 who are practicing Christians actively seek out porn at some point in a given year. Yeah. And 1/5, 20% of practicing Christians ages 18 to 30 actively seek out porn weekly. Nearly 1 in 5 Christian millennials ages 25 to 30 actively seek out porn at least monthly. And these are Christians.
Yeah, I know.
15% of Christian women say that they watch porn at least monthly. And this was interesting statistic. Only 13% of Christian women said that they never watch porn. So 87% do at some point. Over 1 in 5 youth now you're getting into the church. Over 1 in 5 youth pastors currently struggles with porn use. So that's 20% of youth pastors are struggling in this area. over 94% of youth pastors and 92% of senior pastors believe that porn is a bigger problem for the church now than it was 20 years ago. And that makes sense with the proliferation through our devices. It's so easy to get a hold of. 68% of church-going men, and this one, oh my gosh, 68% of church-going men and 50% of pastors regularly view porn. Half of our pastors are regularly viewing porn. And then you got into some of the information about kids. The average age that kids see porn is 11. 95% of kids see porn by the age of 14. I had a recent episode with Kristen Jensen. She wrote an incredible book. It's Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, to help your kids. You can start reading these when your child is 5, 6, 7. She's got a junior version that is really probably for ages 4 to 8. And then the Good Pictures, Bad Pictures is a book that you can read with your kids, probably 7, 8 to 12. And it really prepares them to understand what pornography is at their level, and because I think what happens with these kids, they're encountering it and they don't know what to do. It's exciting on the one hand. On the other hand, it's shame inducing and secret. So they keep it secret and then they get involved. You know, they're lured into this addiction. Whereas these books are a tremendous way of really getting that topic out there and help to porn proof your child's mind. So they understand you're not in trouble because you saw this, but I need you to tell me because, she goes into the danger and how it's addictive at their levels in ways that they can understand. Awesome. It's really, really cool. I just wanted to throw that in there. That's an episode we've recorded recently. It'll probably air before this one does, but that's the statistics there. And you quoted Josh McDowell, porn is the greatest threat to the American church today. And you can see why. These statistics are mind blowing. So we're mirroring the culture in this, and those who are leading us, our pastors, are struggling with this and sexual sin in different ways. So no wonder it's coming out. And what happened with your friend who was a minister in your former church, we're seeing more and more and more. Just happened a couple of months ago with another one of the biggest podcasters in the country, her husband. And you just look at this and your heart's breaking. You're like, Lord, help us. We do want it to come out so we can be free from it. But at the same time, we're clearly not dealing with this well in the church, are we?
We're waiting till the disaster has struck, right? And then it's like right now, if you hear, like you see a tornado, right, happens and there's disaster, everybody says, oh, we got to help. You got to send money. You got to send people. So, I mean, we're very good at disaster response. Or not, but we are better. But we need to do more prevention. And I think the prevention, so it's easy. So it's interesting too, because the book is it's not a book about porn, right? And I make a point of trying to talk about that in the book when it's about, it's interesting why porn is a big part of the conversation though, because it is hidden and it is secret. So by the time you get to adultery, I mean, there's already a pattern of thoughts, right? And it doesn't have to always be the route of porn to get you to that. But then I also think, like we talk about women and porn, the layers of porn in our country now in the culture of 2024 now is also nuanced in that what is porn?
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of think of Games of Thrones, whatever that show that was on, and people, the Christians were hollering, don't watch it. And I guarantee you, most people were watching it anyway because the viewerships were so high. But regardless, the point is that porn? You could say, yes, it is. But there's a story. So does that make it less porn than watching like a regular, XXX, whatever you would find it. So when people think of porn, you can shut your brain. Well, I don't watch it because you don't go on those sites, but you might be deeply embedded in my story is not visual porn as much as it was reading, as many women end up reading a lot. I mean, you say, well, I don't read fantasy. I don't read, whatever fantasy or romantic erotica, whatever it is that category you want to call it. But the reality is it is what people are reading. I make the point in the book, like you could say, some are not as bad as others. Like Colleen Hoover, I quote in the book, I write about the book. I don't quote her, but I say like when you go to the Amazon best-selling list, Colleen Hoover has like 6 out of the top 10 books. 6. I mean, that's think about it. No one writes best-selling books. You could write one. She has multiple at a time that have been weeks in best-selling books. Now, people are like, her stories are so entertaining. She makes a point of writing an erotic scene in every book. So, what do you do? Skip it? Again, you go, well, is that really porn? Well, yes, according to God's standards. And worse than that, you could say, well, that's soft or whatever. But that's what gets you hooked.
Right.
So it becomes a release. So I think there's a lot of middle-aged women. It's not just the kids that are struggling with it. People who are listening right now, there's a lot of middle-aged women who might be feeling the monotony of everyday life, and you can't go and travel places and run ministries and do all the things you want to do. And so what is your escape? It might be Netflix binging. It might be reading things that are easy to read, because it's harder to read an intelligent book all the time because your brain wants a break. And so it's very accessible now. You go on your Kindle, they give them all free. You don't even have to pay for those books. They're all. And so again, you see how the access to those resources that are under this big umbrella of porn are many times the entryway, even respectable entryways, to what ends up hooking people. And then as Satan, as we know how sin works, what initially might be like, well, this isn't as big a deal. I can watch that. I can handle it. Eventually becomes something that I'm not going to tell people that I read this, even though you might even be bolder than I am, be like, oh, I'm going to put it. I don't care what I watch. Let them judge me. There were a lot of Christian friends and people from churches that I used to be surprised. They would write their, like their thoughts on shows that I was like, wow, I can't believe you're telling people you're watching this. Cause it was like, you'd almost watch it in secret, but not tell everybody. But so there's some segment, which I commend them. Kudos. If you're going to watch it, tell people you're watching it. Don't be a hypocrite. But I'd be bold. But sort of it shows you again the culture that no longer thinks that there's anything wrong with that. And so we lose our conscience. Mm-hmm. The more that's where I think Christian church has been affected by culture, and it is happening in our generation, in my generation, and even more, now imagine if it's happening in my generation, how much more it's happening in the next and the next and the next.
They can't even relate to us when we have these conversations because they're like, "What are you talking?"
So when you hear a 52 woman who started off getting saved as a child, gave her life in camp, who set out to be a missionary, gave my life to teach the Bible at age 20 something, ended up being a doctor by Dave, noble, life-saving, pediatric ER doctor. I mean, and struggling with managing this area that was heavy with, content that I wouldn't want anyone I know to know that I read, and the immediate effect of what that does, which is a pattern of masturbating. And, I talk about that in the book very bluntly. Why? Because it needs to be discussed. So if you think of me, I am the person that people come and listen to teach the Bible. Mm-hmm. How, again, you could say, she's exception to rule. I don't think so when you hear the statistics that you just told me. Yeah. And when you scroll in your social media and hear about the camp that's imploded now, Christian singers we used to listen to. I used to love certain singers, and God knows all the stuff that, they've gone into. I mean, the scandals are a mile a minute. And you go, well, how does it get to that? Well, because they don't do what I ended up doing, which is to say, Lord, and this is honestly purely the goodness of God in my life, to say, I don't care what the cost is. I don't care if they like the title. I don't care. I want to be free. Yeah. And if this area, I am no longer going to live in this dark, I could go years without falling in the trap of sin. But inevitably, there was a pattern in my life of escaping to things that are easy and that feel good in the moment. And so, controlling the body, crucifying the flesh, it takes work. And so after months of that, I'd be like, I'm done, I'd be tired or overworked or whatever, disappointed, and fall back into those patterns of sin. And I got tired of that. And the older I got, the more tired I got, because it felt like, why am I not being transformed the way that I'm teaching that God wants to transform us? And I'll tell you, a lot of that freedom and transformation happens when you tell your truth, when you tell the story, when you no longer are willing to hide those areas, so that the hardest conversations to have with your kids are actually the ones that are going to help set them free.
Praise God. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's true. I think we've gotten so blinded by our culture and so influenced by our culture. I've had those conversations. I've had those conversations with women. There was a big, you remember Highlander, that show. It came out, and I was talking to a friend about that, and she was like, well, it's not bad to watch that. They're married in the movie or in the show, right. And I'm married, so it's okay. It's okay to watch other people. And I'm like, my spirit was immediately like, oh my gosh, this is it's right. Pornography. There are pornographic scenes grafted into a really fascinating story. And that's where, it's easy to get sucked into that stuff. And the Lord convicted me about that. And I think we all have our crutches. Sometimes they're more acceptable than others, but they're all idols. They're all idols. Even if it's a Hallmark film or a cheesy Christian romance. I picked up one of those in the library the other day just to see what they had in them. And I'm reading it. And yes, it's sanitized in the sense that it doesn't go full on sexual and there's not heaving bosoms and all of that stuff. But it just like, what is the point of this? It just is. There was such a cultural messaging in there of sex, of romantic, erotic gratification.
Well, and it's really what you, in our conversation in email before, like you said, it's that in a sense, even when you think about it in the Christian romance world, it's this purity culture that sort of highlights, elevates this. Oh, well, if you're good, but so I did a couple things in the book because I am a product of the purity culture, and I don't even think that I saw it as clearly, because I always felt like, well, I didn't wear the ring. I didn't go to the place and wear a sweatshirt. Like, I grew up in Lebanon, but the message was clear growing up that if you behave a certain way, God will honor you with a husband. And then he tells people who are, I never got that far, and if you're a good wife and you're a good husband, whatever, God will honor you with a great sex life that has multiple orgasms, whatever it is that we think is going to make us happy. And those shows, whether it's Christian version of it or not, that's sort of the hidden, I think the hidden danger is this idolatry of the perfect life, the perfect marriage that is so naturally intimate because you married the wrong one. If you don't have intimacy with your person, then something is wrong. And I think, again, and so the easy fix sometimes is to ignore the problem and to find your fill with a show or a movie or a binging or whatever, because that lasts longer. But you're still empty inside. And one of the frustrations that I had, so two things that I tried to do in the book. One is to answer why. So every chapter, they're short chapters, is here's one of the reasons why we turn to those things that we hate, right? And so like it could be you're bored. I think boredom TikTok to me is a cure for boredom. Although I prefer myself American Idol little reruns that show up on my Facebook. But the point is we're so bored, but we're not supposed to be bored, right? I mean, you can go down. We want to control things. We're control freaks, or you go through the shame. And what's your why? What is it that has led you down that path that you keep finding? Why do you have to find satisfaction in those things? I have been miffed in my life to understand, why isn't God my first choice when I feel down or tired? Why? What is it that blocks that way? And God has really used, I've gone to a counselor, to a therapist, and a lot of that was a gift from the church hurt. What ended up starting as being the loneliness that I felt after the church hurt, to really ending up being a relationship that allowed me the safety to talk openly about some of the stuff that I never thought I would ever talk to anyone about. And in a way, I was looking to talk to someone. I just didn't have someone that I felt was safe enough to talk to, which I think is another thing I address in the book. Like, the church ought to be the place, a Christian home ought to be the place where we're able to discuss these things without feeling further ashamed. And yet it seems like sometimes the last place that we find ears to really sit down and walk through the hard work of discipleship. It's not quick. I meet weekly with a therapist, right? So it takes years. It took me 2 years before I brought up the heart of why I needed to continue seeing hers, because I needed to get into, why am I looking for these patterns? And I've also been wondering in my life, like, why isn't God our first choice for delight? Genuine delight.
Yeah.
And I think we haven't been taught how to delight in the Lord.
Right.
And it's a lot quicker to delight in everything else that we think is good. It's like food or exercise, whatever high that we think, this, and it's really, that's where I think revival happens. And when the Lord gifts you, and you have to start praying for different things. And I think for years, I just prayed that God would deliver me from sin, or that God would, rather than praying that God would give me a hatred for sin and a deep love for him. And that takes, there is no Amazon Prime version for developing intimacy with the Lord. Just like developing intimacy with every other relationship in life, the best friends you have, you talk to them all the time, you are with them. The same can happen with the Lord. We just are no longer teaching people how to experience the Lord through deep, intimate communion with him. And that has been a lot of the fruit of sort of the other side of it now. Even the book came out last fall. And so even since it's come out, I feel like the Lord keeps giving me new levels of freedom and of desire for him, that I think I was taught intellectually for years in the church. Like, I knew the principles, but I think this was standing in my way. There's always guilt, because I always related to God based on how good I'd been. If I'd gone a long time without sin patterns, and I think you notice anyone who's had addiction issues sort of functions that same way. Oh, God will hear me more. You don't even do it consciously. You might even think, I understand grace, but we don't really, because we always feel like I have to clean up my act for God to love me. And the beauty of God's love and grace is that he finds us right in those pits, in those holes, and those, broken places. And that's the gospel. And I think those are the levels of conversation that you have to have with, whether it's your kids or your, people in your life. And I think if anything is sure, like you mentioned, the podcaster whose husband blew up, like you can be living with someone for years and never know that some things about them. Like you don't have to always know everything. And that's a shame. And the sooner you talk about it, but again, don't expect it to be a quick conversation. And in a culture where we're in a rush, where we're busy, where we barely have any margin, who has time to, I don't have kids. And I imagine if I had a youth, I have a 10-year-old nephew that I spent a heck of a lot of time with because he lives right down the street from me. And he spent the winter down in Florida where I'm spending the winter. I leave in a few days, hence my tan. But in case people are watching the video version and wondering why I look so tan, but Sam comes over, and in a 2-hour, I see how much effort it takes parents. Like I see him a lot, and I can appreciate how it would be easier to fix the symptoms of Sam's behavior. Right. As I've watched my sister do the hard work, and he's only 10, so his issues are not at the level that we're talking about yet. But even, by the way, even at 10, he's already had conversations with his mom about issues related to the self-gratification, let's say. As a 10-year-old, I think that seems a little more. But the point is, it takes a lot more time to do the hard work of getting to the heart. Yes. And sometimes I've observed, even my mom and I, who have spent time with my sister, who was down here a big portion of the time, we've had a close-up vision of parenting. My mom, of course, brought us up, but she's older now and it's been years. But it's easy for us to want to be like, dude, just let him be. Can't you be a little easier on him? Why do you have to do that? And like, it's okay. He's not that bad. Yeah. And only a mom understands. And this is just in bringing up the younger people. Well, I think it's even more time consuming to build a relationship with your teen over time that gives the space to sit down and have this type of heart to heart. Like, why do you keep looking at this stuff? What is it behind? Who are you comparing? Where's the pain in your life? It's all rooted in pain. All this behavior is rooted in pain and woundedness. And I certainly had my full share of it over the years. I mean, I've talked about it in all my books. I've been wounded by the church. I've been wounded by, people that I used to be engaged with, somebody that I thought would marry. Like, it's all pain, and that drives us to feel good in a moment, whether it's through masturbation, through pornography, through adultery, it doesn't make it right. It's all sin. But God has sent his son to die for all the sin, but not just to die for it, but to also help us live victoriously day by day in utter communion with him so that the sin loses its taste in our life. That's when you feel victory. Yes. Thank you for that. It's beautifully stated. And I love how you put it in the book. We tend to call it addiction in our culture, but you called it slavery. That's what God calls it. And he doesn't want us to be enslaved. He loves us so much. He wants us to bring us out of that. And it is the hard and holy work of discipleship in the lives of our kids, and getting into those circles in our church, not just being a pew sitter, not just even being a tither, but actually getting there, taking the mask off and being transparent and honest with people. Like you've been with your counselor. I've been doing some counseling myself for some things that we've been going through, and it's hard work. But when you dig up the roots and you can actually move forward into a place of freedom, that's where we can start to thrive. And what I would like to do, if you're willing, I would like to really dig in. You touched upon the purity culture. I think that's a big thing. And you touched upon the issue of shame. I'd really like to dig into some of those topics. If you could stick around, we could continue this conversation in the next episode. But Lina, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been refreshing, amazing. It's just been awesome. So please tell our listeners where they can learn more about you and your ministry, Living with Power Ministries, and your new book. Don't tell anyone you're reading this, A Christian Doctor's Thoughts on Sex, Shame, and Other Troublesome Issues. Tell us where we can find these things. The hub is livingwithpower.org. And of course, I'm on Instagram, probably the most active there, although I'm also on Facebook. You just put in my name, and of course, Amazon and all the bookstores sell the books. Great.
Well, moms and dads, we've barely scratched the surface here today, and we've just defined the problem. In the next episode, we're going to dig into the damaging effects of purity culture in the church, how the prosperity gospel has seeped into our thinking in the church when it comes to sex, and the part that shame plays in sexual sin, in any kind of sin, actually. You don't want to miss it. I want to thank you for joining me today. Look, I know there are a lot of things you could be listening to right now, and I really appreciate that you took this time to spend with me. I hope you will join me for my next podcast when we take aim at some aspect of our culture that threatens to derail our parenting and steal our kids' faith. If you enjoyed this episode of Christian Parent Crazy World, would you consider telling a friend and sharing it on social media and giving it a good review over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and following me on Facebook and Instagram? Oh, and maybe you could say that Christian Parent Crazy World is the best podcast you've ever heard in your entire life. Just a thought. And be sure to check out my website, which is CatherineSegars.com. That's Catherine with a C. I have lots of articles and resources there that will help you on your parenting journey. And if you subscribe, I will be sure to send you some really cool free stuff and notify you of future podcasts, articles, and blogs. I want to end this and every episode with a word of encouragement. God gave you your kids, your specific kids, for a reason. That's because you hold the key to unlocking who God created them to be. We'll see you next time.
Christian Parent Crazy World is a production of Life Audio and Salem Media. If you liked what you heard today, please take a second to rate and review this podcast in your favorite podcast app so that more listeners like you can find the show. For more faith-filled, inspirational podcasts, visit us at lifeaudio.com.